On this edition of the Newsmakers, as Cuba prepares for life without Fidel Castro, we look at the legacy of the man who led the country for half a century. Also on today's program, the dark secret at the heart of British football. We ask why it took so long for the child sex abuse scandal to come to light. And in Picture This, we go into the wild with the best nature photographs from the Natural History Museum's People's Choice competition. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Cuba is holding a 9-day period of mourning for its former leader, Fidel Castro. The revolutionary led Cuba for almost 50 years after the overthrow of President Batista, turning the country into a one-party Soviet-style state. Many in Cuba and abroad praised him as a champion of socialism and anti-colonialism. But others, notably the thousands who fled his rule, view him as a dictator, intolerant of criticism and fond of human rights abuses. Our newsmaker today is Fidel Castro, as we ask whether he was a hero, a tyrant, or both.
Adolorido por la pérdida de un padre que hemos perdido, que es el guía y faro de Cuba y de América Latina y prácticamente del mundo.
Me siento muy feliz, no por la muerte de un ser humano, sino de un dictador.
Even in death, Fidel Castro still divides the world. To his supporters, he was the champion of socialism and anti-imperialism. But to his critics, he was a dictator who oversaw numerous human rights abuses inflicted on the people of Cuba. Fidel Castro became a national hero and president after overthrowing US-backed dictator Batista in a revolution in 1959. He stood up to the United States, which had exploited the island ever since it won independence from Spain in 1898. Castro ended years of corrupt rule and introduced free healthcare and education for the Cuban people. American-owned businesses came under state control, and the economy centrally planned. But to his enemies, Castro turned Cuba into the world's largest open-air prison. Food, clothing, and books were in short supply, and travel, business, and freedom of thought forbidden. More than 3 million people fled Castro's regime, with hundreds of thousands risking death to travel by boat across the Florida Straits to Miami.
Cuba y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 5 decades before handing over power to his brother Raúl in 2008. Castro escaped more than 600 assassination attempts and lived through 10 U.S. presidents. To the United States, Castro was seen as the enemy, a communist dictator right on their doorstep. From the American embargo in 1961 that sparked decades of economic hardship to a recent thawing in relations with America. U.S. President Barack Obama, who restarted links with Cuba, wrote a careful statement. While his successor, Donald Trump, used a different tone. Castro's relationship with the then USSR put Cuba at the center of the Cold War and of the missile crisis in 1962, when Castro asked the USSR to position nuclear weapons there before backtracking 13 days later. Castro spread his revolutionary ideas to Latin America. He also played a crucial role in shaping Africa's history during the 1960s and 70s. He supported South Africa's struggle with apartheid and sent troops to half a dozen countries in their fight for independence.
We have lost a friend, we have lost a leader, we have lost a real friend who made us to be what we are in many ways.
Castro's legacy will be debated for decades, but his accomplishments and failures of his revolution are on display in Cuba today. Fidel Castro once said that history will absolve him, and now the jury is out. Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Palm Springs, California is Christopher P. Baker. He's a journalist, travel writer and photographer who has visited Cuba more than 100 times in the past 3 decades. And from West Palm Beach, Florida is George Bennett. He's a political reporter for the Palm Beach Post. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. George Bennett, the man is dead. Was he a hero or a tyrant?
Well, that's not for me to say. I'm a news reporter, not an opinion guy. I can tell you as a Florida reporter that the opinion of Castro in Florida was that he was a brutal dictator. You know, even it's interesting in reaction to his death, even more liberal members of Congress, you know, emphasized the repression that went on in Cuba. And that's pretty much the widely held opinion in Florida.
Christopher Baker, 1.5 million people fled Cuba. Cuba didn't have 1.5 million rich landowners who were oppressing poor people. So a lot of people didn't like him. A lot of people saw him as a dictator. Is that accurate?
There's some degree of accuracy to that, but it's not the whole picture. Certainly the 1.5 million who left, the majority would have been business people, intellectuals who may have felt suppressed, people whose opportunities were taken from them. But at the same time, there's this other equation. I thought your documentary did a good job of explaining the benefits too. On the island, just to close this point, on the island there are millions of people who feel that he was a father figure, who love him, and you see this today in the long lines in the Plaza de la Revolucion, those people paying homage.
And Christopher, I guess the question is, if he was that deeply loved, why didn't he ever put it to the test at the ballot box? Why did he never allow for free and fair elections in Cuba?
Oh, that's easily stated. I mean, I met him personally in 2003, and I saw the megalomaniac aspect to his personality. It was his way or the highway. So there were two sides to his character. Certainly the power-hungry personality, but somebody who genuinely did care for the underclass. He had said when he came to the USA in March of 1959, 3 months after the revolution, that elections would follow democracy. Of course, he never had elections, but democracy he defined as when everybody is well-fed, well-clothed, and well-educated.
George Bennett, the free healthcare, the free education, a classless society. Is there a lot of good in that from your perspective? And would some of the Cuban exiles, particularly in Florida, be able to see at least some of that and grant some ground to Castro and Castro supporters to say, hey, there was some good in that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've certainly heard a lot about Cuba's literacy rate in the last couple of days. I mean, I just know, again, from a Florida perspective, Cuba is a place where people risk their lives to cross shark-infested waters to get out of there. That's kind of the dominant impression of Cuba that people have in Florida. So, you know, I'm sure, you know, I mean, Mussolini made the trains run on time, so I don't dispute there might have been accomplishments in Cuba, but you know, certainly from a Florida perspective, it's a place that people, you know, risk their lives to get out of.
Yeah, so Christopher, you have, you know, the free healthcare, the free education, a classless society, and then that's juxtaposed with the lack of rights. You know, gays were sent to prison for a long, long time as well. More than 3,500 people killed by firing squad, religion banned, and so on. Was it, Christopher, when you went to the country, did you feel like it was all worth it?
That's, as they say, that's for history to decide, but the balance is both ways. I see the absolute positive at a brutal cost. We all accept the brutal cost. We know what it was. But to the point about rafting too, it's very important to note that the last few decades, almost everybody who left Cuba, continued to leave Cuba, are economic rather than political migrants, but they are treated as political migrants. We have a law in the States that permits any Cuban who reaches US soil to be legal, to stay, and that's a great incentive. And the economic failures of the regime, they're obvious. The communist system has destroyed the economy. We understand that, but at the same time, it's disingenuous for anybody to point to the failures of the system causing this mass migration when at the same time Cuba has had to face 5-6 decades of a US embargo whose very purpose has been to destroy the economy.
George, a lot of what we've been saying revolves around internal policies, domestic policies, you know, the economic collapse. and so on. I wonder, when I think of, for example, where I'm from, South Africa, Castro is not seen as anything other than as a hero because he helped fight apartheid. He supported Mandela and the ANC, so people will be celebrating him there right now in death. So is that where his true charisma really lies? It's as a global icon rather than in terms of his policies back home in Cuba?
Well, yeah, again, certainly his reputation in other parts of the world, I can't really speak to. I just know what I've read. I mean, I can just tell you, again, as a reporter in Florida, that there's a very distinct picture of Castro that people have here. And whether people are on the left or right, I think, he was universally seen by folks in Florida as being a repressive dictator.
And George, with his death, is there a belief, particularly amongst the Cuban exiles, that he perhaps has left the country behind that is being more pragmatic now through Raul with the deal with President Obama, that Cuba can be a country that might open up, might be good for business, and might be a country they might want to go back to in future?
Sure. There's been a lot of, I described a pretty universal opinion that people have here of Castro, but there's been a lot of disagreement even among Cuban Americans about the best policy towards Cuba, whether to lift the embargo and have more engagement with Cuba. I think, generally speaking, the younger Cuban Americans in Florida have favored lifting the embargo and having more engagement with Cuba.
Christopher, if Batista was not overthrown by Castro, would Cubans be better off today, in your opinion?
Well, I've traveled throughout the Caribbean and written many books on all these destinations. And I can compare Cuba to Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Jamaica, where you have a very well-developed businesses, a middle class and upper class, but you have vast impoverishment. And so this is the Cuba that existed before the revolution, and the purpose of the revolution was to right that boat. Of course, we saw that Castro took long-term power, but at the same time, he alleviated the kinds of poverty, illiteracy, etc., that are still part and parcel of these other destinations, the neighboring states of Cuba. So I think that's a very, very important consideration.
Now, Christopher, very finally, did he really give the superpower, the United States, a bloody nose, or was that all perception and optics?
No, he absolutely did, of course. He represented the worst of the Cold War, in a sense, from Washington's perspective, and he set himself out to stick his finger continually in the eye of Uncle Sam, and he did that brilliantly with the assistance of the Soviet Union. Not least for that reason, I think he's seen as a hero among so many states of the world, of peoples of the world, because you look at 1959 and what it was like, and for many of those countries, the USA appeared like a bully.
Sure, but he's also seen as a hero to people like Robert Mugabe, right? Because they find some sort of inspiration there.
Absolutely, that's true. There's no doubt about that. But he saw himself as David to Goliath. My time with him, I saw this perspective, and he was on the world stage. He loved that theatrical role. He needed the limelight, and he played it brilliantly. I called him a pathological genius.
Okay, gentlemen, we look forward to seeing how this unfolds and how the relationship between Cuba and the United States particularly evolves in the coming weeks, months, and years. Christopher Baker and George Bennett, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come in the Newsmakers, the child abuse scandal being brought into the open in British football. And in Picture This, we look at the best images from the Natural History Museum's People's Choice Awards. It started with one lone voice. Andy Woodward, a former player for Crewe Alexandra Football Club, said he had been abused as a child by his coach. Since then, many more former players have come forward, alleging abuse at a number of different clubs. Now, the police, the Football Association and FIFA are all getting involved, as the Newsmakers' Randolph Nogel explains.
A dark side has been exposed of what is commonly thought of as the beautiful game.
At first there was, 2, 3, 4 lads that used to stay there, and there was always 2 or 3 in the bed.
More than 20 former English Youth League football players say that as children they were sexually abused by their coaches and trainers. Leeds United and Blackpool are the latest football clubs to be implicated. Crewe Alexandra, Manchester City, Stoke and Newcastle account for the others. But there could be many more, along with many other victims.
I think this could, as I said earlier, I think this could run into hundreds if not thousands. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Former professional English footballer Andy Woodward was the first to come forward.
Last week I was on here, I was on my own, and I was so scared. I can't thank the public enough and the media, and more importantly the lads for backing me up, I'm just totally overwhelmed.
If Andy hadn't spoken out, would you have ever come forward?
Not in a million years. I keep telling Andy this, what he's done is so brave.
I know what he has been through, because I've been through exactly the same, and all the lads have been through the same.
We're getting people still calling us about allegations of abuse in the past, and we're also getting parents coming through to us asking what is a very relevant question: is my child safe in football now?
The shock over the revelations about child sex abuse in English youth football has led to concerns that it may still be going on. The Football Association has confirmed it's investigating further allegations. There are reports that Crewe were warned that coach Barry Bennell had sexually abused one of his junior footballers in the late 1980s, but that higher management allowed him to stay on at the club.
But also what we've seen on this case is that this was a coach who was found guilty in America and then came back to the UK. So how do we best share between different country FAs to make sure that coaches aren't moving around football as well as within countries where concerns have already been alleged?
There are now fears that football clubs paid victims' families to keep quiet.
I believe there was a conspiracy, there was a paedophile ring, and there was people at those football clubs that had duty to look after the welfare of young boys coming through their system.
This is just the latest child sex scandal to rock one of the UK's major institutions. As more victims come forward, investigators will not only be looking at the scale of the abuse, but who knew about it and whether it's still happening. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Marilyn Hawes joins me now from London. She's the founder of the child protection charity Enough Abuse UK. Marilyn, good to talk to you. It's really painful to actually watch, these guys and their testimony, Andy Woodward and others. It's really awful to listen to them recount what happened to them. Do you believe there's been a systemic failure to protect children?
Yes, I do. And I think it's indicative of large organisations. They're very powerful, and I think they have ability to sweep things under the carpet. And I think that's true of all large organisations, including schools, the church, government. They try and cover it up. And I think this is a very sad time for sport, because this isn't even actually about sport. This is about paedophilia and infiltrating. Where there are children, you will always find paedophiles. That's the attraction, that's the magnet. I think it's shameful and dreadful that Crewe Alexander covered up, but I'm not surprised. Yes, it will still be going on because children play sport, but I think we have to take some of the hysteria away from it, if you like to call it that. Obviously, I don't know if you know, Andy Woodward is one of my ambassadors, and I have to tell you, my own children were abused, and I listened to their testimonies, and it's not always easy to be the founder of the charity. I become at that time the mother of 3 boys that went through it. So although I hear these men talking, I hear little boys talking to me, when it happened, and it's really touched me deeply. And I've been helping Andy and his family a lot, and the pain for me is actually heavy on my heart. And sport, I was a teacher. My area was music. Wherever there's children, you're always going to attract it. You can put in whatever policies you want, but they will find a way through it. Such is their drive and intensity to abuse. They will see it as a challenge. They will get through it, round it, and over it. And that's why what we do at Enough Abuse UK and why Andy has joined us, we absolutely focus on the behaviours that, you know, you can change your policies, you can make people report, mandatory reporting is necessary, but it is essential you actually recognise the behaviours of grooming, and that is what we do. That is what has not happened, hasn't happened apart from what we do at Enough Abuse UK. And the reason I do that is because I saw a paedophile at work. He was my best friend for 17 years. There is nothing you can tell me about the paedophile activity, and there's nothing that's going to stop them other than the fact people need to learn. And, you know, Nelson Mandela, I used a quote earlier this week, you know, he actually said education is the best weapon we have to change the world. And as I was a former teacher, I'm a massive fan of education. And we show grooming is an experience. It's not a finite thing. And we demonstrate it. We take you into the experience of how it will feel when you're watching it. And I think that's essential.
And we're all trying to protect the next generation, but I wonder, how do you solve this riddle when you have somebody come out now in his 40s and says, you know, when I was 10 years old, a coach sexually molested me. Maybe you have a denial from a coach. Maybe you have a denial from a club saying, hey, we didn't cover anything up. How do you get justice for that person?
Well, to me, the greatest injustice was that it ever happened in the first place. So I don't know. I think justice is different for every person as well. For somebody, it would just be, I just want to feel peace again. For somebody else, it would be, I want money. I want compensation for what I couldn't have in my life, all those broken contracts that I didn't get. For somebody, they want incarceration. But the pain is still there. And you know, we have here child abuse law firms where, you know, and I heard a case, well, a lawyer came out and said, you know, if you can prove that because of this abuse you lost football contracts, you lost your career, then there is a case, most definitely, against the Football Association. But I also want to add here, around football and all sport in England at this time, over the last 2 decades, has been a very large charity in our organisation called the NSPCC. I would love to know what they're almost conspicuous with their silence. They've set up a helpline. But in 2 decades, what weren't they training about that made people alert? And that really, truly concerns me how miserably that has failed. And now we're looking at this terrible fallout. And of course, what happens is you've kept it suppressed for so long that when you finally have your space and you're heard and you find your voice, it comes up like a volcanic eruption and there's no stemming it. It just comes up and then it's like a wave machine, it's like a tsunami, and then it comes down again. I have been deeply concerned the last few days for Andy. I've been on the phone to his partner many times trying to keep them calm. I don't think people realise you know, I don't think they realise how much the media, thank God for the media, have grabbed hold of this and really thrown it out there, which is obviously what they ultimately wanted, not to have it silenced again, not to have it closed down again. You know, if you want to change this in society, you'll never stop it. You'll never stop it. But you can do a lot better. The guy that did this, Barry Bennett, and yes, he would have been part of a large paedophile ring. I'm most certain of it. But, you know, it's very difficult to stop that being elsewhere in sports. It will be in swimming. It will be in dance. You've got highly competitive industries that children want to go into, you know, like, oh, I want to be an Olympic runner, I want to be an Olympic swimmer. That to buy into that dream requires extra commitment. To buy into that dream, your parents buy into the dream as well. Extra commitment. You give a lot of your time, a lot of your money, and absolutely right, sport is the most amazing thing ever. And that's why I want to stress this isn't about sport. And may I say, this isn't just about sport in the UK. This will be worldwide. Where there are children, you will attract paedophilia behaviour.
Marilyn, it's been a pleasure listening to you. Thank you very much for coming on the program. Good to talk to you. And hopefully we'll have you on the show again in the not too distant future. Bye-bye. In today's Picture This, the Natural History Museum has released a list of finalists for its People's Choice Wildlife Photograph Awards. The competition runs until January the 10th, and you can choose your favorite online. Let's take a look at some of the entries. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.